How about I pray for us, and then we'll begin. Father God, thanks for your word that's written to us. Thanks for the opportunity to study it together in detail and to plumb the depths of your word together. And we know, Lord, that your wisdom is greater than we can ever imagine or even hope to grasp, but you have stooped so as to speak to us so that we might know you and relate to you and receive your salvation. So we thank you for your grace to us in giving us your word. We pray for your grace upon each one of us to open our minds and, more importantly, our hearts today, and help us to be an encouragement and to be edifying to one another as we look to sharpen one another, as we look to learn from your word together. And please, bless our time together, and we pray that all our technology works too. Amen. All right. Did any of you jump into our live stream just before for the morning? Yep. All right. It came across okay? All right. That's good. All right. We ended last week with a little bit of homework that Dave Thompson gave us, and he sent in a slide with a few notes, I think, from the article that you were asking people to read. Did you want to speak to that a bit more, David?
Yeah, hi everyone. Hope you all can hear me. Just give me a thumbs up or a wave to make sure. Yep. Okay. Oh, a few thumbs down. Okay. So yeah, I just want to remind people that New Bible Dictionary is a great resource, and it really is a wonderful complement to help with some of the studies that we're doing. So don't just limit yourself to some of the words we might pick out and be thinking through. There's a whole host of words that come through the studies worth doing. But as you remember from our study, it seems like a month ago, a couple of weeks ago, when we were looking at what it is in terms of biblical context, literary context, all that whole aspect about moving from promise to fulfillment. And I guess it was worthwhile that we look at the word promise in the New Bible Dictionary. Interestingly, as we look through, and thanks for sharing the screen there, Dave, yeah, a promise is a word that goes forth into unfilled time. That is, it's something to happen in the future. I promise that I'll help you clean up the yard, or I'll help Jenny, I'll promise Jenny I'll wash up tonight, that sort of thing. That's into the unfilled time. Interestingly, when we look at what Scripture is saying, Hebrew itself doesn't have a similar word. And I think that's worth noting when we think through a lot of these Old Testament passages, that the concept of promise for us is probably different to what it meant for the original hearers. And I think that's one of the things we'll be thinking through, and Dave will pick up that today, as well as I will next week in the studies. We think about what's the original context. In Hebrew, it actually was more forthright in terms of someone spoke with regard to something in the future. There's not a sense of, oh yeah, I promise to wash up tonight. It was, the Hebrew would be more equivalent to saying, I will wash up tonight. So you get that sort of slight sense of difference. And I think that is really important for us to know when we think of a lot of the promises that God has been making. And particularly if you think through, and Dave will pick on this today with Abraham and the children of promise. The most important thing, outtake for us, is as what the New Bible Dictionary was talking about. It's the assurance of that continuing and future action. And don't tell Jenny, but maybe I'll have to wash up more often than just tonight. And it's interesting that the passages, as we think through, and we'll be looking at over the next couple of weeks, all talks about the Old Testament promises, that point of convergence where all the old promises meet together and come together from different angles and different time zones and whatever, all converge in the Lord Jesus Christ. And hopefully by the end of this study that we do, not just today, but the end of this subject, that clarity will be so strong for you and will actually provide a great foundation. So there you go. I think there's a few things in terms of that. There's a couple other ones with Christ. That is, it's all that God's promises are confirmed in him, and they've been affirmed by him. And for us, where we are today, as we look at, and we'll go through that chart maybe at some stage, but as we look through waiting the return of Christ. So our role then is on the promise of his return, we'll actually be doing his work. And so I think that's an important aspect to think through. And what we'll be looking at today is God's promise to Abraham is, as you may have heard so many times, as Paul refers to, it was counted to him as righteousness. So the promise to God is correlated to faith. And that faith is for all of us who similarly believe and become children of the promise. Over to you, Dave.
All right. Thank you very much, David. That was really helpful. No, I was thinking of, where did I hear it? It was Mary Poppins. No pie crust promises, easily made, easily broken. There you go, a bit of culture for you. All right, so we just looking back at our last study, we were looking at a particular structure for interpreting scripture and working through those particular steps as we come to any passage of the Bible, really, looking particularly at its context, both literary and historical, how it fits in the whole Bible, and then how we apply it. And we'll get to the application today at the end of the Unit 4, but only briefly. A lot of that work we'll try and get you to do yourself, but we might pick it up as see where you honed it in on next week as well. We're going to look at Genesis 15 this week, and we're going to try and pick it apart a little bit in terms of its context, especially in this unit, the literary and the historical, and then put it into the biblical context in the next unit. So that we can begin, we might get someone who wants to read Genesis 15. Who wants to begin? I've got it on the screen, but you can feel free to read it yourself from your own Bible if you want. Who wants to jump in? I'm looking to see who's going to unmute first.
Sure.
Yeah, Catherine, thank you.
After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him, This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord, who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans, to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites.
All right, excellent. And the gigabytes and the megabytes. And there's well done. Thank you for that. And the Vegemites. Yes, we forgot them. They often get left out for good reason, because Vegemite is disgusting. All right, we're going to begin with something less controversial than Vegemite. What we're looking for is, we're going to begin with the literary context, and then move on to historical later. And it often begins with the very basic things. What you do when you pick up a newspaper, you pick it up, you look at the front page, and you usually expect the front page is going to contain news. You flick over to page 5 and 6 perhaps, and you'll notice the opinion section, and that's going to be someone who's writing what they think the government should or shouldn't do, or what they think of this particular issue, or how it's going to turn out. It's not news, so is it? It's someone else's idea. And then you flick over a few more pages and end up in the classifieds. Then you go to the sports section. You might even look at the weather. And each time you do that, you adjust the way in which you read, because you know the particular form of writing that you're reading, whether it's meant to be delivered as fact, whether it's something that's delivered as opinion, whether it's something that's trying to sell you something, or whether it's a prognostication of the future with limited guarantees. So we do exactly the same thing when we read the Bible. So to work through the model, what we're looking at here, pretty straightforward, that it's a narrative. And so it's an unfolding story. You don't get all the facts at the beginning. You've got to read along. You've got to not try and be like a really annoying person that you watch a movie with sometimes, who's constantly asking you, but why did he do that? How come he's the murderer now? I thought it was the other guy. And all you really want to say to the person watching the movie with you is, yeah, you know what, as the movie goes on, we'll unfold and we'll get to know it. I know about as much as you do. Maybe I'm just venting. So there's all sorts of writings in the Bible. I'm not sure if we've gone through this before, but can you think of other kinds of writings in the Bible apart from narrative? Just quickly, throw them out there. Hit the space bar.
Poetic.
Yep. So Psalms.
Prophecy.
Prophecy, did someone say? Yep. What's the really weird one?
Eschatological.
Eschatological, yeah. So, and often with eschatological, I mean, there's eschatology in everything just about, but quite often you find it with apocalyptic as well, don't you? Apocalyptic is what huge amounts of Revelation are, most of Revelation, and large parts of Daniel, the second half of Daniel, from chapter 7 onwards. So lots of different styles, and we need to adjust as we do that. And so Genesis 15 is narrative. Then we want to ask, where does the passage fit into the structure of the book? So what's the immediate setting and the context, and then the broader setting and the context? And so the immediate setting is pretty much what's right in front of us, the words, the phrases, repeated, the key ideas, all those sorts of things. It's just a basic comprehension stuff. So we can say pretty clearly, Abraham, as we've just read, is concerned about the promise of a son not yet to be fulfilled. That's the context in which this dialogue in the narrative seems to come about. The next question we're going to ask is, what's the broader setting and the context? So where does it sit in this whole story about God's promise for a son? Because this is not a completely new idea. We have those other promises as well that we saw. So what we've got to do is actually have a look at the passage itself and also where it sits. So if we go back a little bit, we can work through some of the chapters that have led up to this promise here and where they go beyond it. This is on those notes that I sent out, is where it says group exercise. But we'll kind of talk it through, and feel free to get my F's and TH's right, to chime in at any point as well. So Genesis 12, 1-3 was where we heard those fairly formative promises that God gave to Abraham back in straight after the story of the Tower of Babel and all those sorts of things. So if we're talking about promises and we're talking about offspring, this is where that largely begins. What happens in chapter 13 is we get God promising again to give him the land, so reaffirming that promise, and also reaffirming the promise of offspring. So the promise isn't forgotten; it's not dropped. Then we've got chapter 15 that we're looking at today, which is Abraham questioning that promise. And then if we go to chapter 16, after that, what happens here? It all seems to go a little bit awry, doesn't it? They take matters into their own hands because, well, I can't remember how much time there is between here and that promise. Do you remember, Dave? I think he receives a promise at about 75.
Yeah, it was about 50. Yeah, I think you're right. It's at least 12 years, if not a little bit longer than 12 years, when he got that first promise.
By the time he gets by the time the son is actually born, we're talking something like 25 years. So it's helpful to remember those things, because sometimes that speaks into that's another part of the historical context that we'll come to later. But yeah, it's quite a significant step of time. All right, so they take matters into their own hands. Sleep with Sarah seems to say, sleep with my Egyptian maidservant. Abraham agrees, and a son is born. But that's not the way the Lord was going to fulfill his promise. Chapter 17.
Sorry, Dave, can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
Is that scenario with Abram and Sarai reflecting also Adam and Eve?
Taking things into their own hands?
Yeah, and one following, silly advice.
Yeah. It's got that. It certainly does have that shape to it, doesn't it? And you can see lots of things like that. It's a good pickup, Ross. Yeah. And perhaps those sorts of things are meant to prick our ears up and think, hang on, what's going on here, and what is it comparing it to? So yeah, that's really helpful. All right. Now, where are we? Chapter 17. So we're again widening the context. Where does this promise go? So chapter 17 is a covenant, or a reaffirming of that covenant. And part of that reaffirming of the covenant, or reminding of the covenant, is some name changes for Abraham and Sarah, and also the covenant of circumcision. That is something for Abraham, on Abraham's part, to show that he agrees to this covenant as well. So, and then we can go probably as far as chapter 21 and 22 and see where the promise becomes fulfilled in the immediate sense. Abraham and Sarah have a son, but also we have that issue of them wanting to send Ishmael away, and Hagar. So they're dealing with those sorts of things. All right. So part of what we're doing in bringing that together there is to try and get our head a bit around where it's fitting in this story, where our story fits into the story around it. Any other points that people wanted to pick up on in the literary context that they might have seen before?
Sorry, I'm probably on a similar theme. Just, I mean, I always think that Hagar's got a bit of a bum rap with what's happened, but it seems as though the promise that's given to Hagar that he will be a great nation, you know, in his own right. I wonder how much is a parallel to Cain, that God likewise protects him through means and establishes some sort of identity for him as well, despite not necessarily being in favour. Yeah.
Well, there's some similarities. There's some key differences in that it doesn't seem to be of any fault of Hagar and Ishmael, and they're not held to any account for what has happened by God, except that it's just simply not the way God had promised things to come about. It does at least highlight to you that there's always a victim when it comes to sin, isn't there? They don't have a good time of it at least at this point. But according to God, it does get better for them. All right. Any other points that you guys wanted to make there? No worries. Feel free to chime in at any point. Oh, sorry, I missed a little bit. We also had that other development in the story, didn't we? Chapter 22, which just, it's amazing how chapter 22 reads. I find it just sort of sticks out as a completely unexpected development in the story. That we've got this joy of receiving this long promised son, and then this call to sacrifice him. And it's obviously an amazing story in the way it turns out. Abraham shows his trust in God's promises, even when the most extraordinary thing is demanded of him. He says some of the most amazing things. I didn't have it highlighted in here, but when that very poignant moment when Isaac asks Abraham, you know, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the sacrifice? And Abraham just says to him, God will provide the sacrifice. And there's so many levels on which that statement is true. And Abraham only knows a particular one. God has provided the sacrifice and you're it. What he doesn't know is that God will indeed provide the ram, the sacrifice in the place of his son. It's quite an amazing passage. And then, of course, God proclaims that he will surely bless Abraham and reasserts those promises as he has seen Abraham's faith. All right. So there's a couple of things in the particular passage in Genesis 15 that might draw our attention as well. If we go back to Genesis 15, particular words or concepts that we might need to understand. Now, the notes in our More College notes go into some detail there, but we won't spend too much time on those today. But did anybody want to have a shot at what they figured? There's Roy. I'll just admit Roy into the room. At what they thought was a particular word or issue that stood out for you in Genesis 15. Anything that grabbed you? Anybody? No? Okay. Anybody want to have a go at explaining some of those words just briefly? What do you think we're looking at when it says Abraham believed?
Oh, look, I'll have a go.
Go on, Lewis.
Okay. Look, I mean, I guess it's that whole issue about Abraham believing what God said.
Mhm.
You know, he wasn't a sinless person; he was a sinful person. But I gather that's where that crossover of it's something that's been granted by God,
Mhm.
not necessarily something that's been earned by Abram or Abraham.
Mm. Yep.
That's how I basically tried to pick it apart.
Yep.
It's Abraham's faith.
Yep.
Faith, that what God has said will actually happen.
Yep. Yep. But I'll come back at you, Jackie. You've when we say it's Abraham's faith, we're pretty much using the same word as it's Abraham's belief. So how can we tease that out a little bit more?
Well, I see it as a trust. It's Abraham's trust in that God is God and will keep his word.
Yep. Thank you, Tony. Yeah. It's one of the I think belief, faith, trust. They're all fairly interchangeable words, aren't they? It doesn't. But that actually helps us understand the word, because we can then broaden our understanding of how that word is applied. I think the problem I see a lot in everyday circles is the way probably people outside of the faith, or people with a non-biblical worldview, often use that when they're looking in at Christians. They'll often talk about someone else's faith, like whether they have enough faith or I have a faith, and we use it more as if it's like a substance that you have when you're a religious person, or as if it's a particular quality or virtue that you build up. But the Bible seems to be more focused on who you put that faith in. And Abraham, although he is, there are various things that he does that show that he does trust, as in putting his son on the altar ready to be sacrificed. The faith that he has, or the belief that he has, is in the God who has spoken. It's not sort of some sort of substance that is particularly present in Abraham. So it's one of those words that we've probably got to be fairly clear that we define when we're talking, particularly to people outside of the faith, or outside of Christianity, I should say. What about covenant? Anybody want to have a go at quickly defining covenant?
Contract.
Yep, contract's a pretty good word. So contract is something that two people, at least two people usually enter into. There's an agreement, and usually stipulations about what will happen if that agreement is broken, which helps us understand the weird ceremony. There's a fun picture that I found that isn't too graphic, but you get the idea of what's happening there with the sacrifice of the cattle, the sacrifice of the doves, the arranging of the two halves, splitting them in two. It's going to be a pretty bloody and gory scene, isn't it? Helpful sometimes to paint these things out. Anybody understand what that ceremony was about? I want to have a go at describing it.
Well, that was the ancient way, wasn't it, of establishing a covenant where the person creating the covenant walked between the carcasses, and it was a one-way thing. It was like it was God walking there, so God was setting the covenant. So that's badly explained, but that's my understanding of it.
Yeah, it's kind of a way of saying God binding himself to his own covenant with Abraham. the interesting thing is Abraham arranges, you know, the sacrifice. He arranges the pieces, but what's he doing during that actual walking through moment? Anybody notice what he's doing?
Yeah, he's trying to get the birds away.
Yeah, he does it first until God turns up.
Yeah.
What does he do during the actual ceremony?
Fell into a deep sleep.
Yeah, he's off.
He's waiting.
He's having a snooze. Little interesting detail I find there.
Well, that means that Abraham didn't have any, what's the word, reciprocal agreement with God about that. He's asleep. He's not accepting the covenant, is he? God's making the covenant.
Well, God's making the covenant. I don't know if I go as far as saying he's not accepting it, but it's very clear who's binding themselves to whom in that, it seems.
It looks really good.
Isn't it the situation where the deep sleep and the metaphor about that, it says that darkness came over him.
Yeah.
And that's his doubt. Because then God realizes the doubt in his mind and says, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in the country, not their own. So he's like reaffirming to him. So there's some correlation between going into a sleep and a doubt that he has that's playing on his mind, and then God intervening and saying he's aware of his doubt and then speaks to him about it.
Yeah, well, let's hold on to that thought and see if we can test it later down the track. We'll come back to a little bit more of that interpretation. But that's interesting insight. All right. Okay, so we want to move on. We've done a little bit of the literary context, and we want to do a bit more of the historical context. But you'll find in historical books like Genesis and many other books in the Bible that some of those literary and historical things will overlap with each other anyway. And we might find out this is a fairly recursive process. So the historical context is what we're going to look at next, is where it sort of sits in all sorts of quite concrete situations. So people, places, dates, obviously. We're looking at in the relation to other places, distances, all those sorts of things, and the particular situations of the people involved. So if we go back again through some of the surrounding literature in Genesis, we can pick up a bunch of other things in there as well in the historical context as well. So we can go through a few more of those passages, and you can see a little bit of the family situation in Genesis chapter 11 and where they have traveled. So Abraham's father Terah is there, Abraham and his brother Nahor. You've got the unusual situation of Terah, of Haran dying. It seems to be noted as something unusual that he would die while his father was still alive. And then Abraham and Sarah and being married, and their travel from Ur of the Chaldeans, apparently going to Canaan, but stopping short in Haran. So if we put it on a map, there is Ur on the right-hand side there, Haran up the top. They were heading down to Canaan, but they seem to have stopped. Good things just to get your head around as you keep going in that historical context. Plenty of other places where you'll find lots of information, and you've got to be careful sometimes. You can go down a deep rabbit hole with these things, and if you are preparing a Bible study or a sermon, which I've found myself down that rabbit hole so many times and I've gotten hours and hours into preparation, just chasing interesting things and not coming up with much that's useful. But that's part of the joy of studying the scriptures, isn't it? Finding those cross-references in your Bible, usually in the center column if you've got a cross-reference Bible, and Bible dictionaries will give you a good overview. I find they're one of the first places I go after the scriptures, because they're usually quite consolidated.
Don't mind, which new Bible dictionary do you use? Because one I've got's fairly old.
Yeah, well, it's been updated a number of times. So I've got one that's electronic on my computer, but I would have purchased that, I don't know, 12, 15 years ago, perhaps. That'll only be updated bit by bit as research has been added, things have been revised. But if you've got that new Bible dictionary, it's about 3 inches thick. So yeah, it's a pretty good volume, and I think we've got copies of it here in church. So if you ever need to borrow one, feel free to ask, and we don't mind photocopying an article or two every now and then, and emailing it out to you if that's helpful too. Let's look at Abraham and Sarah's situation as well, where they are. So again, there's a couple of different ways in which we can look at it. We can look at it sort of chronologically, or we can look at it thematically as well. But it helps us get an idea of where they sit, get to know their situation so that we can speak about it. So we looked at them. They started off in Mesopotamia. They went to Haran. At the beginning of chapter 12, God calls Abraham to leave his family, his wider family, take his wife and head to Canaan. And so our story is situated in Canaan. Abraham also goes down to Egypt and back, but for the most part spends his life, the rest of his life, in Canaan. But where are we in terms of those promises, particularly in chapter 15? No child. He's in the land, but he doesn't possess the land. Certainly no nation has come from him, and certainly no blessing has flown from him to all other nations. So noting where we are helps us get into Abraham's head as well as we read that. So that's obviously the thing that's picked up in Genesis 15 very early on in that passage. It seems to be the principal thing that's on his mind. I'm childless. We have no children. You haven't given us any. And also that seems to spread into some doubt about the land. How will I know that I'm going to take possession of it? And so the point of what we're doing really is to get us out into the wider context, out into the historical context, and then keep driving us back into the text, where that's going to leave us. Abraham's given up a lot, hasn't he? He's left his family, his wider family, and all that support that would bring to him, and he's set himself up in a new place as an outsider. And you can understand some of the impatience. Where's this child? Where are these promises? And so, again, thematically, we can look at that promise in chapter 12, where he received the promise was given. We saw it renewed in 13. In chapter 14, we saw it lived out. I just don't know if I put the text in there. Chapter 14, we saw it lived out in the way in which he. Let's find my notes here. The way in which that was the story of Lot as well. And then he questions those promises in chapter 15, and we'll see in the rest of the passage that he receives assurance as well. So you can see there's just a couple of different ways in which to find that context, both geographically chronologically, and then in thematically in terms of the promise, which is really what's driving a whole lot of Genesis as well, is how are these promises going to be worked out. So what's the meaning and the purpose of the passage in the original setting? That's where we're trying to end up in this part of the exercise. And you can ask that question of what does it mean initially even for Abraham? What does it mean for those who were intended as the original readers of the passage? And is there a future movement suggested in the passage? That's the sort of thing that we're trying to head for here. So let's look at the original readers of the passage and see where we can go from there. So we very quickly get that concern in chapter 15 of Abraham's wondering where that promise is. Verse 4, the promise is repeated by God, and then we get these two assurances: look up, look at the stars, and look down at this ceremony where God binds himself to his promise and to Abraham. Does anybody else want to comment on that, of what else it might have meant for the original readers of the passage? All right, you're hiding behind your screens there. Feel free to slow me down if I'm going too fast.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I think you've probably said it, I just missed it. Who are the original readers of the passage?
Okay. No, I don't know if I did say that. Who are the original readers? Well, who do we normally ascribe as the writer of Genesis?
Moses.
Well, Moses.
Yep. And we see plenty of times in Deuteronomy, some pretty big speeches from Moses. So it's common for Moses to be speaking to his people and guiding them. So we expect perhaps if Moses is described as the author of Genesis, that a lot of the people of Israel were taught these stories and these events as they perhaps journeyed through the desert, and preserved with the people through, after that, I guess, through Judges, through the early monarchy, until it seems the scriptures were lost for a great deal of time, and picked up again by Josiah later on.
So who actually did write
Moses?
Oh, so Moses is the typical person that we ascribe as the author of Genesis through to Deuteronomy, except obviously the part about his own death.
Yes. Okay.
Yep. So, go on, Tony.
I find it interesting that Abraham was, I assume, comfortable in questioning God and say, "Look, you made a promise and nothing's happening." Which, he's questioning a God or a God himself. But he appears to have that relationship, I guess.
Yes, that's a really important point, Tony. It's something that will come up again later on as well. So, and something that is a product, it seems, of that faith relationship as well, and helps us expand and understand what that really means to have faith. Okay. What do you think is the, before I flick over to the next thing, what's the future movement in God's plans? Is Genesis 15 giving us a hint of any future movement of God's plans?
I should not read it.
Yes. He's promising their land at the end.
Yep.
Those other nations.
Yep. Yep. So they're quite concrete, those promises too, aren't they? And a future promise needs to have some sort of concrete reality to it. As David explained before, it's a what was the phrase you used before, Dave? That we saw at the very beginning?
So allow me to unmute myself. Sorry, the phrase.
Yeah, about promises.
Well, it's sort of those. It's not time related. It's an unfulfilled expectation of something to come.
Yeah, an unfulfilled expectation of something to come. But they do have a concrete outcome. They're not just sort of wishy-washy, wishful thinking.
They are told 400 years or 4 generations or something like that, weren't they? So there was a bit of time specified there.
Yeah, yep. It's there are some there's some indications given of what's going to happen in the future and some time specifications, but in terms of the complete fulfillment of those promises, it's not as specific, is it? And that's one of the things we'll trace out, is how those promises spread out and are fulfilled across the whole of the scriptures.
And Dave, is that also reflecting, you know, going back to Adam and Eve type stuff about populating, you know, subduing the land type reference? Is that sort of, you know, acknowledging a, you know, another shift that's occurring in God's original plan about what he had for creation?
Yeah, you're picking up on a really, I guess, a very broad theme that comes across the scriptures. So whenever God is blessing when God is blessing, he's often gathering, he's drawing people in towards himself and around himself. When he is cursing or punishing or judging, he is scattering, and people are being scattered. So God creates Adam and Eve, and he is with them. He walks with them in the garden. They are gathered to him as his own people. And what happens when they sin is they're cast out, they're scattered. When the people of Babel, build the Tower of Babel, what's the punishment to them? Their languages are confused and they are scattered. When the very next chapter, God starts gathering again by drawing Abraham into a relationship with himself, and then begins that promise that's going to lead to him building a people that he gathers around himself. And so you have that gathering language of the tabernacle in Exodus, and what's the punishment that comes upon Israel when they are unfaithful to him many years later? They are scattered again. And so same as when Israel were refusing to go into the promised land at the first time, when they came onto the edge of the promised land, their bodies ended up, of that generation, scattered across the desert. So there's always this scattering and drawing in dichotomy there.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was picking up on, was that connection that his land was intended to be populated to do his purposes.
Yeah, that's right. And God in the midst of that, gathering his people around him. All right. So Abraham's response. Just got to find where I am on my notes here. Okay. So Abraham responds to this promise we see in verse 6, and there's those big words that we need to probably do some more work on later, that he believed the Lord and credited it to him as righteousness. And in the Moore College notes, it goes through a fair bit more detail, which we'll look at later on in Romans 4, about what that actual righteousness is and how it's related to faith. And we already talked a little bit about Abraham's part in that ceremony, that he prepared that ceremony, the sacrifices. He waited for God to turn up, and scared, drove off the birds of that were coming after the carcass. and he slept. He slept through most of it as well. All those sorts of things are going to help us understand what's going on in that passage. And we talked about the future movement. I'm just falling behind on my slides here. So God promises, God's promises ask for a response from us, a response from the receiver, and that is to trust that he is good for those promises. And I think it was Tony who picked up on it before, that Abraham seems to be comfortable enough with God that he can actually question him and say, well, what's happening? How are you going to fulfill these promises? And oh, there you are, Tony. This is that. This is heading to what you were saying before. He has this relationship with God that enables him to talk to God and ask him what's happening. And that seems to be something that is a product of how faith works as well. I'm still trusting my God, even though I'm asking him, how will you do this? So faith is not faith is not blind. It is not mindless. It's something that is lived in a relationship. And it's another way that we could express it is it's just saying, I know this person and I know that they are good for the promises that they have given me. I can trust them. And finally, that there seems to be something attached to this son that Abraham is going to have. There seems to be some, well, obviously, if he's going to become a great nation, it has to start with one. So there's a lot hanging on this promise. We can understand Abraham's anxiety about it. All right, we talk about what does it mean to have faith in God. Oh, there you go. I was going to suggest we take a break. I've done a lot of talking. So the purpose here is we're going to stay in Genesis 15. We're going to use the model, the things that we've looked at before to help us understand the passage. Not so much, well, we've done the literary and the historical. We're going to figure it out in its biblical context. So where it fits in to the story of the whole Bible, and where it fits into the way in which God has brought about his plan to save his people, and how he is how he's executing that plan. So we've looked at we're gonna ask a couple of questions as we go, and that is these questions here. So where else in the Bible can we go to that'll help explain Genesis 15, that'll help unfold Genesis 15, and then where does Genesis 15 fit into that story, that whole story? So pretty obvious there where we are in that diagram that we've been using over the last couple of weeks. There's Abraham right down there. It's a beginning, almost the beginning of his story, kind of the second or third installment of his story, which is a big story. So Abraham's going to be a very, very big key character in the whole Bible. So understanding his story is obviously a good place to start anyway. And then we're going, and then obviously the other diagram that we have used is where it fits in the salvation history or the salvation plan. And so I've kind of nominally put it around there. We're going to follow a bit of a process as well that helps us, I guess, think about the passage in that biblical flow, in that story flow. And that process is one that you would have seen in the book and in your notes. It's looking at where it fits in that whole movement through the Bible. So we have the historical beginnings, which we've looked at a little bit of. We've got the prophets who pick up those promises and look forward to them being fulfilled. We've got the promises being fulfilled in the scriptures. And then we've got the new creation that that the rest of the New Testament speaks about. And so that's the sort of movement. And any passage in the Bible, we want to find out where it sits in the movement of that story, where we can place it, and then we can, from different points of that story, look forward or look back, or both. Now, of course, Genesis 15 is very close to the beginning of the Bible, and so we've already considered the historical beginnings. What we didn't do is go right into Genesis 1 to 11, but if you've done Old Testament 1, you've spent a fair bit of time on that as well. But obviously that's going to inform a lot of what we say, particularly when it comes to thinking about what it means, particularly for Abraham to be declared righteous by God. We know that Abraham's a sinner because all people are sinners. Sinners entered the world. We learnt that in Genesis 1 to 11. But we're going to pick out and learn what it actually means for God to declare him as righteous in the context of what we're reading here in Genesis 15. And so that'll help us there. But then we're going to move into this other section, the prophets looking forward. So there, I should have moved my slide. The prophets looking forward. So where we are with Abraham, we're going to skip forward a bit to some of the prophets in a moment. And what I'm going to do in a moment is put you in a breakout room to read some of the scriptures that are looking back or using language or being in some way informed by Genesis 15 and what it has already taught us. So Abraham obviously had his son Isaac. Isaac had his son Jacob, who was later renamed Israel. He had those 12 sons. We've heard the story of, we might remember the story of Joseph when he was imprisoned, or basically betrayed by his brothers, imprisoned in Egypt, became the 2IC in Egypt. And then we skip over to Moses at the beginning of Exodus, and the whole epic saga and story of Israel being freed from slavery in Egypt. We've just been through Joshua in church and looked at the conquest of the land and the division of the land. Then we move into Judges, where we pick up the way in which Israel fared in those first probably 200 years in the land. And then Kings, where we start with Saul and David and Solomon and a whole lot of other kings. We're going to move just beyond that until we get to the passages that we're going to look at. And there's two questions that I'm going to get you to deal with. And oh, hang on, is this my breakout? No, this is not my breakout room type. Well, we're going to read this one together first, and then we're going to break into two groups later down the track to work on some things together, and then we'll come back together as a group. And don't worry, this will just automatically divide you into two groups, and then I'll bring us back together. But let's, for the first part, now that we've sort of moved ahead into the whole storyline of the Bible, we're going to look at a particular part of 1 Kings and see where Genesis 15 has landed at this point in the history of Israel. So let's read Genesis 4, 20 through to 34. Do I have anybody keen to be a reader for me before my voice goes hoarse?
Yeah, I'm happy to go.
All right, thanks, Lewis.
Okay. The people of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They ate, they drank, and they were happy. And Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms of the Euphrates River, from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines as far as the border of Egypt. These countries brought tribute and were Solomon's subjects all his life. Solomon's daily provisions were 30 cores of the finest flour, 60 cores of meal, 10 head of stall-fed cattle, 20 of pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep and goats, as well as deer, gazelles, roebucks, and the choice fowl. He ruled over all the kingdoms west of the Euphrates River, from Tipsar to Gaza, and had peace on all sides. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, lived in safety, everyone under their own vine and under their own fig tree. Solomon had 4,000 stalls of chariot horses and 12,000 horses. The district governors, each in his month, supplied provisions for King Solomon and all who came to the king's table. They saw to it that nothing was lacking. They also brought to the proper place their quotas of barley and straw for the chariot horses and other horses. God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight, and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East, and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else, including Ethan the Ezrahite, wiser than Heman, Calcol, and Dada, the sons of Mahul. And his fame spread to all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He spoke about plant life, the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the walls. He also spoke about animals, birds, reptiles, and fish. From all nations, people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom.
All right. So there's a lot of things that you can probably hear in that reading that you go, I just heard that in Genesis 15. I thought we'll go through a couple of them in this passage, and then we'll divide into two groups, and I'll get you guys to go through two other passages, and then we'll come back together. But there's a couple of things that obviously that stood out. We heard the words that his descendants, or sorry, the people of Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Abraham was promised that that his descendants will be like the dust of the earth or the stars in the sky. So very quickly, a pick up on that promise seems to have been fulfilled at this point. We also saw that they had the land. Solomon ruled over the kingdoms of from the river to the land of the Philistines as far as the border of Egypt. So north and south and east and west, they have the land and then some, I think. So the land promise seems to have been fulfilled. Then we had all this long section, or reasonably long section, of all the different things that Solomon owned and had, and all the riches that were there, that nothing was lacking, and we can recall the promise broadly of Abraham being blessed. And then later on, we also hear that there was nothing lacking, a table filled and constantly provided for. All who came to his table received everything, they all paid their tributes and things like that. So it's quite a picture of everything being exactly how it should have been. And also then finally his fame spread to all the surrounding nations. Abraham was promised earlier on that his name would be great. So you can see those promises starting to, being largely fulfilled. And you can see in which the way people came to him for wisdom as well, in other parts of there, that people are seeking that same blessing that seems to be given given to Solomon that was promised by to his ancestor Abraham. Now, of course, you'll probably be familiar with the broader story that this time of peace and prosperity, these good times, they came, but they soon went after Solomon's time as well. Kingdom was divided into two different sides. Other nations came and overthrew the northern kingdom, and then later the southern kingdom. And so the big question biblically in the broader picture hangs is what has happened of God's promises. And so we're going to look at a couple of those, couple of passages that kind of draw out what is happening to those promises. So this is what we're going to do. I'm just going to set up 2 breakout rooms, and this will assign you automatically to 2 different groups. And I'm going to put the first one to ask you to read Jeremiah 1. That's a typo there. It should say Jeremiah 5, 1 to 19. So to remind you, I'll name I just got to do this on the fly. Jeremiah 5, 1 to 19. That's the name of that group. David, Glenn, Jackie, John, Luke, and Tony. You'll end up in that group. So that's David, Glenn, Jackie, John, Luke, and Tony. Will be in that group, and that'll obviously include you too, Don, because you're next to Glenn. And I want you to ask these 2 questions. So why did Israel get judged? What is the hope? You might need to jot these down because I won't be able to display these later. And do any of the promises to Abraham have any bearing on that passage? And how is that? So take a moment to jot them down. Now for everyone else, Helen, Catherine, Kevin, Lewis, and Roy, I'm going to get you to read Isaiah 60, the whole of the chapter. I'll just name your room that so you remember. Isaiah 60, and what I want you to do is ask, so it's speaking, the context is it's speaking to Israel scattered. They're not in their home country anymore. Again, the same question, what are the promises of God? And what is the future of Israel? So see if you can pick those questions up. So we'll take 10 minutes to do this, and then I will call us back. Good. And I've just got to... Okay. Do we want to quickly say something? Can I get someone from the Jeremiah group to quickly mention why, like what the judgment was for, what was the hope? Have a look at those questions.
That God's people, there is not one person who is still faithful to God. God can't find one. So his wrath will be that they will lose the land and the blessing of nationhood.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, they haven't kept their part of the covenant to be faithful, have they?
No, but yet God will preserve a remnant. He won't destroy them completely.
Yep, which is something that comes out near the end of that passage. Yeah, even in those days, declares the Lord, I will not destroy you completely. Yeah, but it's on the terms of those promises that are made to Abraham, particularly in Genesis 15, and others, that those are the things that were promised, and those are the things that are withdrawn, but never completely. It's on those sorts of terms. Okay, group 2, Isaiah 60. What did you pick up of those promises of God there in the future of Israel?
I'll say a couple of things and others can jump in. So what we saw was the promises of peace and prosperity being one of the things that were highlighted. There was this reference to darknesses and light, knowing that Israel was about to plunge into darkness. So it's talking about things to come. And talking about a blessing coming through Israel, which, and therefore Israel being seen as a bit of a lighthouse moving forward. This whole sense of peace with righteousness, which ultimately highlights the fact, which was a bit of the contrast that we picked up from, you know, the reference in Kings to this passage in Isaiah, is that in the Isaiah passage, the Lord is front and center, and therefore it's, I guess, a culmination of the journey. It's the fulfillment, where everything that God always planned is now reaching its final stage. And it's also acknowledged too that there's going to be trouble for Israel. It's not going to be straightforward, but the promises will be fulfilled. And later in the chapter 60, it talks about an everlasting light, ongoing promise. And there's a sense of righteousness, righteous people that will be forever. You know, others?
Anybody else from that group want to add anything to it?
I just picked up, following on what Lewis said, that they're going to be dark times. Or they have been forsaken and hated. I will still make you an everlasting pride and joy. So he's warning them about tough times ahead, but the promise will still remain. And I love that little passage there in verse 16, where it talks about you'll be nursed at the royal breast. I think that was a lovely illustration of how God will care for his people.
Yeah. Yeah, he uses quite intimate terms, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that speaks again of that that relationship. Yeah. Okay, really good. But you can see that the prophets, as they pick up these as they pick up these promises, they're constantly looking forward to them being fulfilled. They never drop that, even in these moments of judgment. They often have a message of judgment. And yet there's always this element of hope, and that hope comes from the fact that God has made these promises, that they're not going to be dropped. He doesn't fail to keep his covenant with his people. So that reinforces for us the importance, or the logic, I would go as far as saying, of trusting God, that he is someone that is good to keep his promises. That seems to be what the prophets model for us, to keep looking forward, no matter how bad things have gotten. Even if those things have gotten bad because of Israel's sin, they're still to look forward. There is still a glorious future that Isaiah points to, that seems to be even better than the one that has been previously seen, with David and Solomon, that we saw in the previous passage. So that judgment is real, but those promises are solid, and they're not going to be dropped. Which again goes back to a little bit, reminds us a bit of what David was saying at the beginning, with what the nature of promises in the Bible, particularly promises from God. So that's the prophets looking forward to a particular fulfillment of those promises. Now, as we keep tracing through that storyline of the Bible, looking for how this fits into this, how Genesis 15 fits into that overall storyline, we end up in the next part of that, which is the promises being fulfilled. And to do that, we're going to have a look at Matthew 1. But here's a question: how do we know where to look when we move into the New Testament? What sort of things can we use to help us find our way there? Anybody got any ideas or thoughts about that?
It's generally linkages. So whether it's practices, whether it's names and families, whether it's, it's that continuity of the message.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's always references in the New Testament of promises being fulfilled, and that is going back to the Old Testament. There's always references.
Mm-hmm.
If you've got a good Bible, it'll always flick you back to the Old Testament promises and how it relates.
Yep. And so we picked.
You've got the opposite as well, where you've got the Old Testament, and at the bottom of the Bible, it gives you the passages in the New Testament that it's linked to.
Yes, or sometimes in that center column. I don't know if you can see it in.
Yep.
Let me try this. No, it's not going to work. It's going to cut it out. But in the center column, I've got all these cross references in my Bible, and sometimes you go, oh, I'm not really sure how that works. But other times it'll take you to parts of the Bible where the same idea or the same phrasing is picked up and used as well. A good concordance will do that as well, although that can sometimes get into the anatomical, atomizing level of cross-references, and you can get a bit lost in that. I find those ones in the Bible which are a bit more concise are a little bit easier to use. But again, going to looking for those key words that we picked up on. So thinking about righteousness, or key themes, thinking about faith, and going, well, where does that theme get picked up in the New Testament? And that may lead me to a good place to help me see how trace the change in that theme, or the development of that theme from Genesis 15 through into the New Testament. And things like that. So there's a few ways in which you can do it. The most helpful way is obviously to know the scriptures, because read lots of the Bible. I found in my preparation for my first year college exams for the Old Testament, all I ended up doing for 90% of my study time was just reading the Bible, just getting my head around more and more of the content and how it all fit together. And you're never going to waste time. Never going to waste time doing that. Yeah. All right. So let's jump into the fulfillment of the promises, and we will go to Matthew chapter 1, verse 17, and have a look at a couple of have a look there. Now I've saved you from reading all of Matthew. Just in between the dots there is a lot of names. They're very important names. I would never normally skip over a genealogy, but I'm conscious of time. So I'll read this one. So Matthew 1 begins with a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, yada, yada, yada. Thus, there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to Christ. Now, what is very easy, quick and simple question, what is that giving us? What is that reminding us of, or relating to Genesis 15?
Abraham.
Yep.
Abraham is he's the father of Christ, ultimately.
Yep.
Earthly father.
Yep.
I mean.
So Matthew's summing it up very clearly in at the end there in verse 17, that he really, really wants you to see the connection, the hereditary connection between Jesus, between Christ and Abraham. And so we've got a reminder there of the promise of offspring to Abraham. There is something incredibly significant that someone is the offspring of Abraham. All right. The other major passage that we can look at is Romans 3 and 4. There's a lot in there. I want you guys to read this in a bit more detail at home, but we can work through it reasonably quickly, and then we'll come to a bit of a discussion of that. But the question we're looking at is, again, what of Genesis 15 does the Apostle Paul pick up, and sort of why does he do that? All right. We've got that. This is a pretty well-known, famous part of that passage. But now a righteousness from God, apart from law, has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. This righteousness from God comes through faith in Jesus Christ, to all who should have had a lot more of that highlighted, to all who believe. So straight away you could see a pretty good connection to Genesis 15 there. We've got the big words of righteousness, we've got faith, or we've got believe, and we've also got that connection of Jesus Christ, which we connected to Abraham. So you start to see those things flowing through. That's the sort of stuff we're looking for there. People are justified. Does anybody know what that means when somebody's justified? Anybody heard that word before, or got a
just as if I'd never done it?
Just as if I'd never done it.
Made right.
Yep, made right. So that's going to start helping us understand what it means for God to credit Abraham as righteous when he when Abraham believes the Lord. So there's something about it's not that Abraham in himself is righteous, that he's never done anything wrong, or never will do anything wrong from here on. The story of Abraham certainly makes clear that he does do things wrong, but that somehow God makes him right through faith. And God doesn't do that by overlooking sin, because as we go on in verse 25 there, God demonstrates his justice by punishing sin through Jesus and justifying those who put their faith in Jesus. We move on to another part, to verse 30 there. We've got the reference to circumcision and faith. There is only one God who will justify the circumcised by faith, and the circumcision and the uncircumcised through that same faith. So now if we think of Abraham as the one who had the covenant of circumcision with God, now that's being expanded on the basis of faith. And that informs, or is what Paul develops in Romans chapter 4. So Romans chapter 4, a direct quote from Genesis 15. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So Paul, why do you think Paul is bringing Abraham into the argument now? Anybody want to have a go?
Because Paul's talking to Jews who would understand that the promises made to Abraham, that they would hopefully see the link that the promises made to Abraham have been fulfilled in Jesus.
He's building that link that the promises made to Abraham are fulfilled in Jesus. He's also showing them who truly belongs to the people of God. The Jews have understood themselves as the people of God, but Paul is expanding that, or showing that in reality the people of God have always been the people of God by faith, not just by birth. And so we're expanding out what it means to be part of God's people, or probably better articulating what it means to be part of God's people, and explaining the function of faith in that, and how that makes us righteous and part of God's people. So if we go on to Romans 4, we've got, let's work out where I'm going. He's bringing in some quotes from David. Do you notice the words that he's using? In the beginning of verse 7, the beginning of verse 8, and even in verse 6.
What, the man reference?
No, in verse 6 here, he's talking about blessing, isn't he? Yeah. I mean, these are fairly surface level observations, but blessing is something that we're looking for in the context of those promises to God. And so Paul is picking up on how David has talked about blessing of those who are declared righteous by God. And then he goes on to expand to show how that's not just those who are physically circumcised, but those who are circumcised in the heart, those who are part of God's people by faith. And he does that by, again, going back to Abraham. Abraham is the one who trusted and believed God. Because where was that? Where did God declare Abraham righteous? It was in our passage today, wasn't it? Where did the covenant of circumcision come?
After.
Yeah, chapter 17. So again, the historical context and the context in the whole flow of the scriptures helps us see a little bit more about what's actually happening in Genesis 15. So yeah, he received circumcision, but it was a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith in verse 11 while he was still uncircumcised. So he had that righteousness by faith before. My page. Okay. And where am I going with that one? Okay, and that guarantee, or that Paul's establishing in this section, that it's the same for everyone else as it was for Abraham. Verse 16, the promise comes by faith, so that it may be by grace and may be guaranteed to all Abraham's offspring, not only those who are of the law, that is, the direct descendants, but also those who are of the faith of Abraham. He is the father of us all. And Paul's bringing out that promise in verse 17, I have made you a father of many nations. And so it's established now that faith that Abraham had back in Genesis 15 is the faith that we must have in those promises to be part of the people of God. And so we now can see from our end of the Bible, after the cross, looking at this letter to Paul, what that faith was actually doing back in Genesis 15 and how that was working out to bring about those promises. We can see those promises fulfilled. Romans 4:19 to 25. Paul is summing it all up there. Where have I gone here? Can't find my notes for that one. There we go. Yeah, so just so that the object of our faith, again, just as it was the object of Abraham's faith was in the promises that God had given him, the object of our faith in verse 25 is the death and resurrection of Jesus. So though Abraham had no idea how that promise would be finally fulfilled or lived out, how indeed people would be able to be declared righteous and God still be just. But we see that now in the death and resurrection of Jesus on the cross. So our faith is, I guess you can say our faith is so much more informed than it was with that Abraham was able to have. He looked forward, he looked from a great distance at those promises, he trusted those promises. We look back at something so much more filled out, I guess. The promises with so much more flesh on them, literally flesh on them, in the flesh of Jesus, died and resurrected. We are in a much more privileged position, I guess you could say, and yet it is still the same faith that is actually what saves. All right. So those were the questions that we looked at. What is it? What's Paul? Why is he using Genesis 15? How is he using that? We looked at that. He's gone to Abraham, who is the father of the Jews, but he's expanding out to say, look, it's not just hereditary. You need to understand what really made Abraham righteous. It was his faith in the promises, and that's no different for anybody else, whether they're Jew or Gentile. Galatians chapter 3 is another passage that the notes go into a bit more detail in, the more college notes. And so I encourage you to go and have a look at those as well. It'll help you make the same point. So that's the promises fulfilled. Paul has explained to us, Matthew has pointed out to us that the promises that we were looking for in the offspring of Abraham, that longing for a son, that wondering about a son, that Matthew connected it for us, and Paul has explained it for us, how that connection with Abraham and faith and righteousness and Jesus all comes together. So those are the promises fulfilled. Now we move on to the final part in that whole flow of the understanding this in the biblical context. The flow of the Bible is in the new creation, or what was the terminology that we used? I should have repeated that slide. Yeah, we talked about the historical beginnings, the prophets looking forward, the promises being fulfilled, and then how this biblical passage is seen actually fulfilled in the new creation. What's the future to it? And for that, we can go to Revelation chapter 7. And again, I'm not going to go through the entire part of it, just picked up on a few pieces of Revelation chapter 7. So we've got the Apostle John in his vision, seeing the number of those who were sealed, who were marked as the people of God, 144,000 from all the tribes of Israel. I don't want to say controversial, but people have often got caught up on these parts of Scripture. We've got to do our work and remember that we're looking at apocalyptic writing, so we've got to read it a bit differently than we would narrative. But we're getting this 144,000 is a number that seems to be quite large. It seems to be specific in terms of it's 12,000 times 12,000. We remember the 12 tribes of Israel. We'll remember that 1,000 in apocalyptic language usually just means big, large, lots and lots. And so it's giving us this impression of a complete and large number of all of God's people, all the tribes of Israel. So the feel of that as we read apocalyptic. Sorry, my phone's going off here.
I gather, Dave, you meant it's 12,000 by 12 tribes of Israel.
Oh yeah, 12,000 by 12 tribes. 12,000 times 12,000 is a bit more, isn't it? Yeah.
Only if I've got my maths wrong.
Maths was never my strong point. Yeah. So again, we're looking for the fulfillment of these promises, the fulfillment of the number of the, descendants being like the stars in the sky. And then Revelation pops up with these, in the new creation, this idea of a large and complete number gathered around God. And it fills out a bit more in verses 9 and 10. No one, a great multitude that no one can count, from every nation, tribe, and people and language, standing before the throne and in front of the Lamb.
Can I just make a comment that I don't know, that notion of 12,000 being distributed evenly across all the 12 tribes, to me was sort of reinforcing equity.
Mm-hmm.
So there wasn't a disproportion, which, when you look at all the other numbers that are highlighted, they seem to be all over the place. And that whole sense to me was sort of flagging that, because it applies to every nation, that it's open to all nations.
Mm.
So that's where that equity becomes relevant.
Mm. Yeah. And it, like I said, it comes down to, I think when you're reading apocalyptic, generally, you can go, well, how does this passage, what is this passage trying to make me feel? How am I supposed to respond and react to it, rather than, atomizing all the words and numbers into, and trying to specifically tie down every detail. You end up in a real big rabbit warren with that. But when you see a large number, you're meant to go, wow, that's big. When you see a very specific large number, you're meant to go, well, that's exactly the number that God wanted. When you see a number like 12 times 12,000, where, you know that 12 has got a very specific sort of image to it, I guess, or feel to it. We've had 12 apostles, we've had 12 tribes of Israel. We're pretty right knowing what 12 means in the Bible and how it's meant to come to us. That's the sort of way in which we ought to read Revelation. And you're right too, you get this idea of equity, even distribution, and you get this idea of equity across all nations, tribes, and people and language. So yeah, I think you're picking up the right way. Verses 10 to 12, pick up the people or the angels standing around the throne, the elders, the creatures, everyone falling down on their faces before God and worshipping him. And the idea of God being the one who sits on the throne, the idea of the Lamb there, the picking up the idea that we've been looking for, I guess, is the fulfillment of this perfect fulfillment of the promises. So God's promises are fulfilled, but it's been achieved completely for us by this God and by the Lamb, the sacrifice that justified us. Okay, let's tie this up. Oh, we've got a little bit more there. No, I don't have notes on that part. And we've gone through those questions. Where I even had them written out there. So we've got the perfectly fulfilled church. The blessing that's to all nations has come through the offspring of Abraham. We've got the goal of God's promises, not just fulfilled, but realized, salvation by the Lamb. We've received, the promises have actually been completed, is what we're looking at in Genesis 7 there. So let's try and draw it together. I know that we've moved pretty quickly, and I've done a lot of the talking, which is a bit hard not to do on Zoom. What's the meaning and the purpose of our passage in its biblical content? A couple of points to make there. So God has revealed saved him and saved through his promises. So as we've traced these promises through the Bible that we heard in Genesis 12 and Genesis 15 particularly, what that has done has actually revealed who God is. He's a God who gives promises and saves through those same promises. So we learn about his character by the way he acts, and he acts through his promises. And so we can, it's not just something that God does, but it's a way in which he allows us to know him. We know him as the God who keeps promises. And that's really important for us to grasp hold on and use to interpret other parts of Scripture as well. We saw that Abraham believed the promises and he acted on them in faith. He did what God told him to do with the certainly in Genesis 15 by the sacrifices that he prepared, even though he was asleep during the ceremony, but also later on in Genesis 22. So Abraham becomes a model of how to actually respond to those promises. We saw the connection between Jesus and Abraham in the passage that we have. Isaac is the one that seems to be that we're waiting for. His birth is part of the promise, and that is a theme or an idea that comes out through Jesus as the one who is born to bring about that promise. And we've talked a fair bit about God declaring a person righteous by faith in those promises. And it's like it's taking God at his word, and not trusting him in that, but actually saying, I believe that what you have said you're going to do, you will do. We see the ultimate blessing come to us through Jesus, as the one who is able to save, the one who actually justifies us and takes away our sin. And we saw how Paul explained that all those promises, all those who believe the promises of God, and that is ultimately seen in putting your faith in Jesus, become part of God's people, become children of Abraham by faith, become part of that blessing. And so ultimately, as God strengthened Abraham's faith in that passage, because he repeated the promise to him, he gave him that ceremony, which was to show him his commitment to those promises. That was there to strengthen Abraham's faith, and it's also there to strengthen ours. The passage is recorded so that we might read that, learn of God's commitment, learn of his nature, and know that he's a trustworthy God. So here's a quick off-the-cuff challenge for you. Can you sum up the main idea of Genesis 15? Would you be able to put it into a sentence that comes together quite simply?
God keeps his promises to his followers.
I was just going to say faith.
Faith? Yep. Yeah. Anybody else?
We can trust God.
Yep. All right. Very good. Yeah, God, I would say, God is the one who can be trusted. God makes promises that we can trust. And that is how we receive his blessing. All right. Well, in the final part of the notes in the Moore College book, it works through the application of that. We don't. I don't think we should take too much more time to do that today. But I wanted to ask you, how would you apply this text to yourself or to someone that you were leading a Bible study in? Remember, we've talked about being part of the people of God. We've talked about being descendants of Abraham by faith. We've talked about being made righteous by faith. How would you apply the meaning and the main idea of Genesis 15?
In Genesis 15, you can see that even that long ago, God had this all planned. We can trust in a God who knows the future, who knows how to bring us to him.
Yep.
And I suppose if you're going to apply like a Bible study, I would just start with God's promises. What were God's promises in Genesis?
Mm-hmm.
And then taking those examples throughout the Bible, how they were fulfilled or not fulfilled.
Yeah. Yep.
Isn't the answer always Jesus?
If you're a good Sunday school student, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, ultimately that's what we've seen, isn't it? That the answer to Genesis 15 was a reiteration of God's promises, and those promises are finally fulfilled in Jesus. So if you want to follow the example of Abraham, who believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness, what did Abraham believe? He believed that God was going to bless him. God was going to give him a son and land and descendants, and he didn't have any idea how that would all fill out, and he questioned God about it. How's it going to happen? I haven't got a son. You haven't given me one. But ultimately, he believed that God would do what he had promised, but not yet done. We stand on the other side of that. We've seen those promises fulfilled in Jesus. We've seen that those promises apply to us as people who put our faith in Jesus. The fulfillment of that promise to Abraham. We've seen that promise will result in the gathering of all of God's people in the new creation, of those who put their trust in that fulfillment of God's promise in Jesus. So the application, I think, is that if you want to be righteous, to be part of God's people, you must put your trust in his promises revealed to us in Jesus, and not try and go it yourself. All right. So that's a lot to get through. We've gone through 2 sessions. I'm feeling very hoarse. Your ears are probably ringing. I know that it's a fair bit of work to get through. We've condensed a bit of it, so I won't ask you to read other articles or anything like that. But keep reading through those notes. They're the key to really understanding this as well. And we're planning on meeting next week at 12:30, same bat channel, same bat time. David's going to lead us through units 5 and 6. So again, it will be condensed. So just the most helpful thing you can do is read through the notes and try and jot down what you can. And there'll be, I think there's a few other gaps in the program that'll help us make up the time as well. So we missed a few weeks, and we want to try and not stretch this out too long. But that brings us to a conclusion of our time today. Did you want to add anything there, Dave, before we finish up?
No, thanks, Dave. Yeah, I'd encourage you, because in the notes it talks a couple of words through the New Bible Dictionary. Just have a look at some of them. I think that's worth just checking out. Gives some good context for some of the stuff. Like Dave said, go back and have a look at some of those passages again. They're fairly critical to our understanding of really what being a Christian is in terms of what God has done for us. So thanks for sharing that today, Dave.
All right, how about I pray for us, and then we'll finish up our time. Father God, thanks so much for your word and the way that we can trace your promises and the fulfillment of those promises throughout the scripture. We can see how your people sought to grapple with what you revealed of yourself in those promises. We can see how many times they failed to obey you and trust you. And we can see ourselves in that failure many times too. But we know that we are justified because of what Jesus has done, and we put our trust in what he has done. And we thank you that because of his sacrifice and the fulfillment of your promises, we can be declared righteous in your sight. And we pray, Lord, that we will be confident in our status before you. We'll be assured of our salvation. We'll be joyful in our relationship that we have with you by faith. And we thank you that you have revealed so much to us and given us such a great blessing in your word. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, David.
And thanks, David.
Thanks, David.
Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, mate. Same to you.
Bye.